Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to get our gardening week started, and we've got a great show set for you today. We're going to be talking about biochar. And I know many of you, my regular followers, are aware that I'm a huge advocate of biochar. I put biochar in most of my garden beds. And today I want to introduce you to just about the greatest expert you can find on biochar, the author of the Biochar Handbook. So let me welcome Kelpie Wilson. Great to have you here, Kelpie.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, it'll be fun. And I know the question's going to come up, but no, we are not related. We we are both gardeners and we both have an interest in biochar. And we chatted a little bit before we came live here. And so, why don't you tell us all a little bit about your background? Because you are an OG of biochar. You go back just about 20 years. So, tell us about the beginnings of biochar and what led you to writing a book about it.
Well, okay. So in the early 2000s, I was still working for a forestry protection group here in Southwest Oregon. And but I was a little burnt out on that work, so I turned towards journalism. So I started writing a column for an online news service on energy, environment, climate, and all those topics. And I heard about biochar probably 2006. And I was so intrigued because I'm a big gardener. And my first thought when I heard about it was, and the terra preta soils in
Mhm.
Brazil, was this is like permanent compost. So I was very motivated to check it out further and I wanted to write more about it, but there was not much happening. It was such a new idea. So I asked a magazine editor that I was doing features for if they would send me to Australia to cover the very first biochar conference in
Nice.
Australia. And that was in 2007. And she said, sure, go cover that for us. So I wrote an article on biochar from that conference, and then I ended up working for the International Biochar Initiative. And then, since then I've become a consultant and a manufacturer of biochar kilns and lots of other things.
So, when you look at the research that's available on biochar, so much of it is used at the industrial agricultural level. It's used in farming. There isn't a lot that I find that is being done for the home gardener. So, when you were working
Mhm.
with the initiative all those years ago, was the focus primarily for large scale growing operations?
Yeah, initially, there really wasn't that much research published. So we're talking 2008, 2009, even into 2000, up to 2012. There wasn't really definitive agricultural research because there just wasn't time to do the long-term studies. So it was hard for people to really go out on a limb and fully embrace it. Now in 2025, we have tons of results from the academic literature that show not only that it's very beneficial, but it helps increase soil carbon over time. A lot of interesting stuff there. But, the extension services are always going to be behind the academic research.
Yeah.
And so it's taken a long time for the kind of official extension services to really understand it. And, they haven't worked with it enough, so they don't really know. But I was really fortunate because I've been doing it myself since 2009. I
Mhm.
started experimenting with it, and then in 2015, I got an NRCS, that's in that Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's an agency under the U.S. Department of Ag in the U.S., and they do this thing called Conservation Innovation Grants, and so they support citizen science. And I worked with a small group of biochar enthusiasts here in Oregon. We got one of these grants, and that let us do a 3-year project working directly with small farmers and gardeners
Oh, nice.
to learn how to use biochar. And I got to do so many experiments that I just really learned a lot. It was great. And so I'd always been doing a lot of workshops in my area and increasingly being asked by extension services at state agencies to come and do workshops for their clients. And I'd been doing all these workshops, and I made a little like Xerox booklet that I called the Biochar Handbook, just to have something to leave people with, right? And I was kind of making 50 copies at a time at the copy shop. And at a certain point, I was like, this is ridiculous. I should just write a real book.
That's right. So, I've many years ago, when I was much more active in the Master Gardener program, I was the first person I knew who knew anything about biochar. And you're right, the Extension Service it is so far behind, and I think I may still be the only Master Gardener I know that uses biochar. So let's talk about some of the basics, and because this is where there can be misunderstandings and just lack of awareness of what biochar is. So when we talk about adding biochar to our garden beds, what is it that we're actually adding? What is biochar?
So when I worked for the International Biochar Initiative, I had the privilege of coordinating the international process of creating the first biochar standards. So I learned so much doing that, working with the soil scientists and other scientists involved in the process and coordinating all that information. And the definition that we came up with was a little tricky because biochar is just charcoal. But charcoal is a material that has a huge range of properties depending on what you make it from. You can make it from wood, you can make it from straw, or nutshells, all kinds of things, depending on the temperature you make it at. So think of the difference between, if you look at coffee roasting, it's a similar process.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a light roast that's almost green coffee, or you can have a very dark roast, like French roast. Or if you go a little further, you would end up with biochar or charcoal if you really heat it up. So there's this whole spectrum of roastedness of a material, and that gives it different properties. And mainly, the more high temperature the process is, the less is left of anything but pure carbon. So at the lower end, you still have, the flavors of the coffee and all those organic chemistry that just goes away at high temperature. So the IBI definition was charcoal that's suitable for use in soil or for carbon sequestration. Yeah. So that means it has to have a lot of that, pure carbon that stays in the ground. And that's really the first thing about biochar. One of the first things, there's sort of two tracks with biochar. One is carbon sequestration and one is soil. And so people are interested in it for different reasons, or sometimes both, but it does make a little confusion about biochar and what it is.
Yeah. And I think because of those double benefits, and as you pointed out, the definition is really quite simple. We're just putting these little bits of carbon into our soil, and it comes from all different types of biomass. Rick is saying that they make biochar in Logan City from sewage in Queensland, Australia. I'm guessing you probably knew something about that. Sewage can definitely be used to make biochar. I have a good friend who is making biochar and selling through some of his meat stores. He was a rancher, and he was making bone char. He was actually making biochar from the bones after the butchery of the cows. And so we can make biochar from anything that is carbon based. Is there a particular ingredient that you prefer when you make your biochar?
Well, just to go back to the IBI standards again, one of the things that is also, a part of that definition is it has to be made from clean biomass.
Okay.
So yes, you can make biochar from anything, but you don't want to make it from some kind of toxic material like railroad ties that are treated with chemistry, right? So that's or municipal waste, garbage. So it has to be clean. And other than that, it's really the difficulty of charring it. So I like wood. I'm in Oregon. We have forests. We have a lot of woody debris. Some of it's causing us a lot of problems with fire danger. So we have a huge amount of feedstock for biochar that's woody debris. It's really easy to carbonize. It has high carbon content because wood has a lot of lignin or carbon in it,
Right.
and so forth. You can also make biochar from sewage sludge, as was just mentioned, and that's a good way to deal with that waste product. It sanitizes it, which can often be an issue with pathogens, so that's a good thing. You need to be a little bit careful about any kind of heavy metal content that might be in that sewage sludge. So it has to be really a grade A sewage sludge, not something that could be contaminated with heavy metals. And then a lot of people are interested in making it from crop waste.
Oh, sure.
So, but when you get into materials that are small and light and fluffy, or even hard materials, if they're small, like wood chips or nutshells, a lot of crop waste can be just, straw, things like that. It's more trouble to process it, especially for a home gardener. So, like I can make biochar from berry canes and fruit tree trimmings easily because they're a little more woody and they're like long stalks. Corn cobs can work, but something like straw is difficult because when you're making it yourself at home, that packs together and cuts off the air that you need for a gasification process. So that's explained in the biochar handbook.
Yeah, and in fact, one of your methods making biochar at home, you use wood pellets, just the simple wood pellets that you would use in a stove or a smoker. And so let's talk about the processing, and if you want to talk about retorts and pyrolysis, we can go to that side. If you want to talk about what you can do at home with just a simple burn and quench, let's talk a little bit about how we make biochar.
Sure, and there's so many ways, and I don't want to get overly complicated for folks. So I'll start by talking about how to make it in a barbecue grill. So say you have a kettle grill, old-fashioned kettle grill, nothing fancy, no fans or gas or anything, just a bowl basically, and it's got little vents on the bottom. And the first thing you do is close those because you don't want any air coming from the bottom with this method. This is called the flame cap method. And in the flame cap method, all you have is a container that's solid with no air coming into it. But so all the air comes from above. And what you do is you could get some kindling size wood, whether that is some chopped up branches from trees that fell in your yard, or cordwood, firewood that's split into kindling size. So by that I mean, about
Yeah,
that
smoke.
size. And you could even go to the grocery store and buy kindling, little bundles of kindling, if you don't have a way to chop it up. And then you just stack that in your grill crossways, like a wood cabin, make a little, we call that a rick. So it's open, got air flowing through it. Put some kindling on top or a little fire starter and light it on the top. And what that does is it immediately makes a flame on the top. And so any smoke that's coming out of the wood is going to burn. So this is a clean process. And what you'll watch as that little stack of wood just burns down into its own footprint into the kettle. And then once you have your glowing coals where you're thinking, oh, gee, now I could barbecue something, put another layer on. And as that layer goes on, it'll burst into flame. And again, any smoke will burn. And when that burns down, put another layer on and keep doing that until your kettle's full. And you might end up with 5 gallons of biochar, depending on how big your kettle is.
Yeah.
And then when the flame dies down and it's mostly all charred at coals and it's starting to ash on top, then you just put it out with water. So to me, that is the easiest way to make a good amount of biochar pretty quickly. And that's what we call the flame cap kiln. And you can do something bigger. That's how the ring of fire works. So that's one method. That's my preferred method. The second method that I'll talk about is using the wood pellets like you talked about.
Hmm.
And those work because they're very uniform. And they can work in something called a top-lit updraft gasifier, or TLUD for short. And I played around with those for years, and there's some instructions for making a little stove in the handbook. And this won't make a lot of biochar, but it's a great project because you make a little cook stove, and you can make, you know, 2 cups, a pint of biochar at a time with it while you're cooking a meal. So this is really neat. It's a camp stove. It's a great project to do with kids. If you want to teach kids about biochar and just, you know, how to make a little camp stove. And it's just a can within a can. And unlike the flame cap method, this method does use air from below. So you take a tin can, you poke holes in the bottom, and you make little legs with screws so it sits up above the ground, and you put it inside a bigger can. And you put some holes around the top of the bigger can so you can put your pot on top. You light it again on the top, and it slowly burns down. And as it burns down, it makes char. And because of the way the air flows, that char doesn't burn until the very end. So it's similar in a way, but the air flows are different. It's hard to maybe explain, but if you try it, these are things you can try yourself and you'll get it. You'll
Yeah.
see how it works.
And you've got pictures and you've got directions step by step in your book,
Mm-hmm.
and it's important to recognize that when we're burning this material, we're burning off those oils and those resins. That's what becomes that fuel. So when you talk about burning it from the top, and the smoke is igniting because all of that is being released, and I see that a common misperception is that we light it like any other campfire. And then people wonder why they just are left with ash. And so burning it from the top down, we don't want the ash. We want the charcoal that's left over. And that's really kind of, I think, an important goal that gardeners should recognize if they attempt to make their own. And so, whether we have 5 gallons or 2 cups, Serena has a question. How often does biochar need to be added to a raised bed, and how much should be used per square foot?
That's a great question. And I think, you know, you've provided that answer really well in some of your videos.
Yeah.
And it, you know, it of course it kind of depends. Um, so if you just have plain biochar, you haven't done nothing with it, but maybe crush it up a little bit. You could safely put about a 1/4 inch over the over your bed and lightly work it into the top 4 inches of soil. A good way to do that is right before you're planting a legume crop, because the one of the disadvantages of just adding plain biochar into a garden bed is that it does attract nitrogen. And so in the first period that it's in the soil, it may attract some of the nitrogen and hold on to it, and your plants would be deprived. So add a little extra nitrogen. That solves that problem, or plant a legume crop. But the biochar just takes time to develop the characteristics that make it so valuable. So it needs to, first of all, don't add really dry biochar because it's hydrophobic and it
Mhm.
actually can repel water until you've soaked it. So you need to soak it pretty well in water first. And if you made your own and quenched it with water, then you know it's already going to be hydrophilic or water loving. So, but if you purchase it or make it in a way, we didn't talk about retorts, but that's another way to make biochar where it could end up dry because you didn't quench it, you stuffed it. So make sure it's wet before you add it. And then really though, the thing that's most important about adding biochar to soil is looking at your soil pH, because
Mhm.
biochar is very alkaline. And so if you are, is your soil alkaline, Scott, where you
Yeah,
are?
yeah, I do have an alkaline soil, and when my friend was making all of the bone char, it was actually more alkaline than the basic biochar,
Mhm.
and I had some difficulty. I ran some tests. He asked me to do some garden tests, And we were actually killing plants with his first formulation because it was so alkaline. Our naturally alkaline soil, and then we used the biochar that was highly alkaline. And it took a while, and eventually he realized he needed to use it more as a mix with compost to be added to the garden rather than added straight to the garden because it was so alkaline.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's and if you add a little bit at a time, it shouldn't make a big difference in the soil pH, but just something to be aware of. Where I live, our soils are acid. We're in a rainforest. And so, we love it because lime is expensive. We don't have a big local source of lime. So some of the farmers here were using it before they ever heard of biochar because they were getting a high carbon wood ash from sawmills, and they were using it just to take a pH 5 soil, which is really acidic, up to something like neutral, which is pH 6.5.
Yeah, and you see that in a lot of or a lot of areas of the United States with acidic soil, and people are spreading wood ash as part of their normal gardening practices, but
Hmm.
not all of us can do that. So let's talk about some of those benefits. Yes, you can help buffer the pH levels within the soil. We talked briefly about the ability for biochar to hold on to nitrogen. I like one of the benefits of just increasing the microbial home within the soil. So would you touch on some of the benefits? We've been talking about biochar, how to make it, but why should we be using it?
Well, can I talk a little bit about the history of
Oh,
biochar?
sure, sure.
Yeah, so when I first started learning about it, it was because of the terra preta soils. So that's Portuguese for dark earth.
In Brazil.
And these are pretty vast areas of dark black soil in the Amazon basin that soil scientists had been aware of for, a few decades, but it kind of came to the fore in the early 2000s because the areas of this were so much more extensive than anyone thought. And when they started digging into it, they found pottery shards and arrowheads and things like that, human artifacts. And it became clear that these soils had existed for thousands of years in the Amazon and were agricultural soils. So they had supported a very large population. Probably more people lived in the Amazon before Columbus than live there today.
Mhm.
So, and an area basically the size of France, they said, is this black soil that, normally the soil in the rainforest is highly leached. It's red, it's oxidized. There's not much in it. All the biomass in a rainforest is living biomass. So as soon as a leaf falls to the ground, something, bugs eat it and poop it out, and that fertilizes the vegetation. So it's a really different environment than what we're used to here. But here are these black carbon rich soils. Where did they come from? People made them over millennia. So that is very intriguing, right? And then as I got into it more, I realized, or I learned that there was a biochar movement in the 1800s in Europe and America. And this was actually started by Justus Liebig, who's the father of agricultural chemistry, who first came up with the analysis of soil fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. He came up with all that, discovered all that, but he also was really interested in biochar, and he started writing about it. And then other agricultural, writers, there were lots of agricultural journals at the time. You can find those on Google Books and look up charcoal, and you'll find out all these people writing about how valuable it is for soil, and especially for managing muck, which is the word for manure, right? And so what people were discovering was that if you mix biochar with manure, which was the main source of fertility at that time before we had a chemical fertilizer industry, that it does wonderful things. It makes it compost almost instantly. And I've seen this myself, got some chicken manure from an egg laying operation that was
Mhm.
very, stinky, shall we say, and mixed it half and half with biochar. Within a month, it looked like beautiful, rich soil. So it really helps the composting process. And and historically, we find all these people who thought this was a great idea, learned about it, practiced it. And then what happened in the 1800s was in the early 1900s, the chemical fertilizer industry really took over. And it was just so much easier. And people didn't want to deal with muck anymore. So now we're coming full circle, right? We're back
That's
into
right.
organic gardening. We're saying chemical fertilizer is maybe not the best thing for soil, and so we want to use organics. And biochar is the perfect companion to help you get the most out of your organic fertilizers, whether it's manure or something like that you purchase, like fish emulsion or other organic fertilizers. It helps you get the best out of those.
Nice, nice. And so, as we apply biochar to our soils, Jefferson Stauffer is wondering what is the best biochar particle size for the garden soils?
Good question, and one that comes up a lot because if you make it yourself, if you're making it from wood, you'll end up with little chunks.
Hmm.
It is very brittle and it's not hard to crush. So what I like, because that's easiest for mixing with anything like compost, is a grain of rice size, a granular size. But a mix of sizes is fine. So for instance, if I'm filling a new garden bed, I might take a couple of buckets of my chunky char and put it on the bottom. Or if I'm planting a fruit tree, I'd put a bit of this chunky char in the bottom, or
Yeah.
in a potted plant, because that'll help with drainage. So go ahead and put some chunks in there, especially on the bottom of a bed. And then the granular size mixes well with your other fertilizers and it's just flows easily. But when you crush it, you'll end up with a mix of sizes, and that's okay because you'll have everything from a powder, a very fine powder, to a granular size, to maybe something that's more like a size of a pebble. And that's all perfectly fine, especially in your environment, Scott, where it freezes. Anywhere
Right.
that freezes, freeze thaw over time will break it down into smaller sizes. And
Yeah.
from a microbes point of view, smaller is better because, if you have a big chunk of biochar, there's pores in it. That's how it really works, is all those pores and surface area. But a microbe's not going to get to the center of that because the pores don't go all the way through.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with that. I like to have a mix for exactly that reason because some of the biochar is being used by the microbes, some of the biochar is being used to absorb and hold on to the soil nutrients. I live in a very dry area, so some of the larger pieces in particular are absorbing and holding on to some of that water uh, and making the drainage better for the overall bed. And so it's difficult to find actually a biochar where everything is the same size. So it's good to point out, thank you, that it can be
But
different sizes.
it can, but that is one of the advantages of purchasing biochar. So I have a biochar producer near me, and it's a power plant, a biomass power plant that makes electricity. And they have figured out how to make biochar as well, which is fantastic because it's really affordable. And what they do in their boiler is they grind up the wood and then blow it in. So it's already these perfect little,
Oh,
grain of
okay.
rice size. And then when it comes out, it's very uniform. And I actually buy some of that because I use a lot of biochar and
Okay.
it's so easy to use. So if you have a biochar supplier near you, check it out. It's hard to buy biochar at a distance because it's so expensive to ship, because it's a high volume but lightweight product. But if you can get it near you, check it out because it's well worth buying it.
Yeah, and so that ties in with what Bud is asking. He says, I found it difficult to find a source of biochar that is reasonable in cost. And like you said, I completely agree with that too. It can get quite expensive. So, how can we get started without a huge cost? So, we talked about a couple of the methods for making it. And why don't you also talk about the ring of fire? What is what is the most cost-effective way for we gardeners if we wanted to start it? And should we go out and get a secondhand kettle barbecue grill, or is there another way that you might recommend for a cost-effective way when we're starting to make biochar?
Sure. Well, the Ring of Fire is a large flame cap kiln. It's 7.5 feet in diameter. It comes in panels that you bolt together, and it turns about 10 cubic yards, which is a lot of material of wood, into about 3 cubic yards of biochar, which is a good amount of biochar, in about 5 or 6 hours. So it's really efficient way to make biochar, but it's really for people who have a lot of wood. So I work a lot with landowners who have woodlots or forest on their property and gardens. And so they're finding it to be a great tool. And it's also something that neighborhoods are purchasing, or watershed councils, and sharing it, because you might only use it once or twice a year. So it's a tool, a great thing to have in a tool library for a garden club, or a watershed council, conservation district. And people can go around to each other's properties and help them do the clearing they need to do, help each other out, and everybody ends up with a nice big pile of biochar. So that's a great tool. But if you're a home gardener and you don't really have a whole lot of material to burn, it's probably more than you need. So in that case, I would say try the kettle grill, or some of these backyard fire pits that you can buy might work, except they have holes in the side usually.
Mhm.
So unless you can plug those holes, it won't work really well. But you can also go to, like a farm supply store, and get a trough, a galvanized steel trough for, feeding or watering animals. And you could find one that's 3 or 4 feet in diameter, which is a good size for the backyard. And it's a solid piece of metal, so it doesn't have the holes, because you need all the air to come from the top to do the flame cap process. So that's a
Mhm.
good alternative, is just find a steel trough. Some of your steel garden beds are very similar to what I would use to make
Sure.
biochar in. So and it doesn't have to be round. It could be square. It could be oblong, rectangular. So I'm looking at one in the background of your
Yeah.
screen there that would probably work fine for making biochar. And if you have one that's long, you can put long branches in it. Or if you have something like bamboo, long straight sticks, you don't
Yeah.
need to have the round. It could be rectangular.
Great, great. So you and I talked briefly about this beforehand, and Gina's asking the question. I don't think it's good to use barbecue charcoal as biochar because of the chemicals. Is that right?
Yeah, I love your carrot picture. That's really sweet. um, yes, well, barbecue charcoal, what is it? There's different kinds. Like if you get the barbecue briquettes, they will often have a petroleum product in them to make them easier to light. So stay away from those,
Hmm.
because you don't quite know what's in it. I have, early on when I was experimenting with biochar, I bought some hardwood lump charcoal, which is made from mesquite, or some other hardwood. And it is kind of okay to use as biochar if you pre-treat it properly. So for one thing, we talked about coffee roasting. That's on the low temperature end of the roasting process. They make it that way deliberately because they want to keep more of the tar and oil in it. So it's not as porous. When we make biochar at home, in the methods I've talked about, it's made in the temperature of a flame, which is a very hot. It's very high temperature biochar. It really cooks out most of the volatile, tarry, oily stuff. So what you're left with is light, highly porous, really much more like activated charcoal that you would use in filtration than barbecue charcoal. So that's sort of your spectrum here. On one end, you've got um, barbecue charcoal, very tarry, oily. On the other hand, you've got activated carbon for filtration. And the biochar we make is about here. It's very much closer to the activated carbon. But this barbecue charcoal, you can, if you crush it up and compost it first, put it in compost, the bugs will get in there and eat that stuff over the composting
Mhm.
time, and clean out some of the pores and charge it up with the good nutrients. And so that can be a viable approach if that's all you have. Just, I would really recommend crushing it. And it's a little hard to crush because it's harder.
Yeah.
But if you can crush it and then put it in your compost, it could be a good source of biochar as well.
Good, good. Yeah, great option. For anyone who's just joining us, I'm with Kelpie Wilson today, the author of the Biochar Handbook. And I've got a link in the description below if this is something that you'd like to check out. I've read it all, of course, cover to cover, lots of good information in there. And a lot of what we're talking about today is demonstrated in that book, and a lot of how-tos. Now, Random Box is asking a good question. Anyone concerned about the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons generated by most backyard ways to make biochar? So, yeah, let's talk about what is burning and what is not burning when we make the biochar in our backyard.
So that's also called PAH, and it's yeah, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and that is a broad term. Just to be clear, that biochar itself is a polyaromatic hydrocarbon. What that means, okay? So hydrocarbon or carbohydrate is, wood, oil, all of those things are hydrocarbons or carbohydrates. And when you convert wood into biochar, what you're doing is you're driving off a lot of volatile organic compounds, which presents as smoke, or in our processes, that smoke becomes flame. So burning smoke, flame is just burning smoke. And so what are the products of combustion then? The products of combustion in a hot flame are mostly carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, with a little water, a few particulates. If some of the smoke escapes the flame, you get particulates. But basically, it's like a bonfire. So it's like any kind of wood fire. It's not any different. In fact, it's cleaner because we burn more of the smoke to the end products of combustion. So then what's in the char? The char itself is a polyaromatic hydrocarbon. And there are other kinds of polyaromatic hydrocarbons that are what you call short chain, that can be toxic. And we don't have a lot of those in char. You might find more of them in the barbecue charcoal
Mhm.
than you would in the char we make, the biochar that we make in the flame cap process. So yeah, it's just a broad term. The short chain ones can be toxic, but we don't find a lot of those in biochar, and we don't find them in the emissions from burning wood, not to a great extent.
Okay, good. And shout out to John Webster, who says, I was formerly the communications director for the U.S. Biochar Initiative. I'm also a commercial biochar producer in Utah. Do you know John?
I know John. Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, we're working together on we're starting a new organization called Biochar On Site. And this is for people who are mainly involved in forestry, but also in farming, where we're supporting a network of people who are going out and converting waste woody debris into biochar to leave in the forest for forest soils, and or on the farm for use on the farm. So
Nice.
he's a great
Well,
guy, and he
thank
sells
you for being
biochar if
here.
you need
That,
biochar.
that's good. As I scroll through the chat, I'm seeing that he's doing a great job answering some of the questions that people are asking about biochar that you and I haven't been able to necessarily
Thanks,
get to yet.
John. Yes, he's a good source of information.
Yeah. So there's a couple different terms that are used when we talk about biochar in the garden. Charging it, inoculating it. The idea is to put some good stuff into it. Now, Big Will Dog has heard that inoculating with urine is also done. You talked about compost. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Why do we want to use urine or compost or legumes or anything to charge or inoculate the biochar?
Sure. So let's start with the terminology because that's been confusing. Oh, I've heard a lot of people say, I'm going to activate my biochar. And that gets confusing because there's something called activated carbon,
Right.
which is very different. And that refers to taking charcoal and with a high temperature steam process, basically opening it up even more so it has more pores and more surface area. And that's an industrial process and an industrial material called activated carbon. It can have very high surface area for for basically for water filtration. So I like to avoid that term because that already has a definition,
Sure.
defined meaning. So charging is a good term, charging it with nutrients. And that is done because when you take a piece of biochar right out of the kiln where you made it at 2000 degrees centigrade, it's mineral, it's inert. There's nothing living in it. It is just a chemical thing, right?
It's just carbon.
It's just carbon, and it's carbon with a lot of surface area that can hold on to because of what aromatic carbon is. And there's another term, and I do try to explain these terms in the book, but yeah, what it means is it's very stable carbon. So carbon comes in so many forms, right? Carbon dioxide, carbohydrates. When we make biochar, all the carbon links up into a hexagonal ring. So think of a hexagon shape, or that kind of star shape. All the carbon is linked up like that. It's in a chain. It's very strong and hard to break apart. So it's just a mineral. But the properties of that kind of carbon is it has a lot of free electrons, and so you get electrostatic attraction. Is a way to think of it. Like when you rub a balloon on your hair and it
Mhm.
sticks, right? So that's how biochar is working in the soil. It's holding on to a lot of chemicals. And those chemicals are, nutrients for plants, nitrogen, um, and other organic chemicals that are nutrients for plants and for microbes. So the microbes, the nutrients get in there, stick to all those surfaces, and then the microbes come in to get the nutrients, and then the small root hairs come in there, to get the nutrients and the microbes, and so that's how it works. And that all just takes a little bit of time.
Yeah. I like to explain it as like a tall tower of condominiums, and the first step is you get the building of the big tower, and then of course you've got to furnish each of the apartments, and then you have to move in, and then when you are in and all the furniture is in and the elevators are working, you start inviting guests, and when everything is ready to go, all the guests show up to your condo and everybody has a big party because all is good within the condominium tower. And
Right.
that's essentially each of those steps is what's happening in the soil with our biochar. You need to have each of those individual parts of the soil life inhabit the biochar so that then the plants, the guests, actually come in and begin enjoying the party.
Absolutely. And it's really similar to soil aggregates, you know.
Yeah.
I think you've probably talked about soil aggregates.
Yeah, and so for people that don't know about soil aggregates, so when we talk about our soil structure, we've got clay or silt or sand is the primary size particle within our soil. And then particularly in healthy soil where you've got the roots and the rhizome and exudates, we've talked about some of that. But when you get little clumps that actually help create a good soil, that's what we're talking about. And so the biochar helps that whole process where we have multi-sized particles within the soil. So it's great for clay soil because it helps in increase the drainage, and it's great in sandy soil because it actually helps hold on to
Mhm.
some of the water. So that aggregation within the soil is definitely benefited by the different size particles. And so Shandy's Garden is asking, what about adding biochar into a compost tea bucket? For people who are making compost tea, and I've got mixed feelings about that. We won't go into, but uh, as the last step, instead of just pouring the tea as a soil drench, what do you think about adding biochar in it? And so now you're drenching your soil with a compost tea and the biochar.
Well, what is the compost tea? If it's actively aerated compost tea, it's basically a bunch of hungry microbes. And if you pour them into a bucket of dead biochar, um, they're not going to have anything to eat. And I don't know how that would work, but just thinking about it, it seems like that might not be the best thing to do. I mean, if you're going to put the biochar then right in the soil, great. But if you're thinking of soaking it for any period of time, I think the microbes might not have much to eat and might not do well. I mean, they might sporulate or anyway. I would actually recommend doing if you make something more like a manure tea or a nutrient solution with fish emulsion and kelp and stuff like that. I think that would work better to charge the biochar with nutrients first and then add some biology, is
That,
how I
that's
would do it.
That's a good point, and that's one of the issues I have with the terminology of compost tea. If
Mhm.
it's aerated, it's very high in the bacteria, in particular, like you were just talking about. I think a lot of people tend to think of bio or of compost tea as more of uh, just dump a bunch of compost into a bucket of water and let it all leach out. And so
Mhm.
that might be closer to what you're talking about, where you
Yeah,
would
I
use it
think
with
so.
manure.
Yeah, the actively aerated teas is where you just take a little bag of compost, you put it in a bucket, and you get an aquarium
Yeah.
bubbler, and you bubble it, and it you only do that for 24 hours, and I personally haven't had a lot of luck with it, but um, and yeah, I think i- if you add it, if you soak it in a nutrient solution, that's great. I think that's all you need to do. And then if you want to add microbes to your soil, I would just do that in a separate process.
Yeah. And so John C is asking, so you touched on this a little bit when you talk about the difference between activated carbon. So can you use open up the filter that you're using for your water after it's been used and dump it into your garden bed as biochar?
So when I first learned about biochar, one of the researchers that I interviewed for my first article about it was she had big fish aquariums, and she was using the filter media from the fish aquarium in her garden and her potted plants, and it did great. So in that case, yes. However, if you have a water filter and you're filtering out contaminants, you might not want to put that in the garden. But yes, you can generally, if you wanted to go buy some activated carbon and put it in the garden, you sure could. But I wanted to also talk about the comment about urine,
Oh
because
yeah.
that is a really good way to charge biochar. And I have instructions for that in the book, how to do that. So it really makes a fantastic fertilizer. It's got nitrogen and phosphorus. One person's urine on a yearly basis provides enough fertilizer to grow all the food that they eat.
Sure.
So it's a wasted resource. And if you have the ability to collect urine in a bucket full of biochar, it's free.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't talk about it often. I talked about it in a video a few years back about using urine in your compost pile for all the same reasons. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think there's kind of this chuckles, let's not really do it kind of a thing. But yeah, I'm glad you said that because it really can be beneficial in the garden. So Big Will Dog's wondering if I were to add biochar, at which time would be best during my hot compost, after or once charged, and then put into my beds?
That's such a good question. I really recommend the very best, easiest, most beneficial way of using biochar is to put it in your compost at the very beginning of the process. And so here's my process. So I have my kitchen waste, and I take it out, every day and put it in a 5-gallon bucket with biochar and with bokashi. I don't know if you've ever talked about
I
bokashi.
haven't talked a lot about it, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because in your book you go in depth with recipes where you're talking about the biochar and the bokashi. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to ask about that.
So it's one of the main ingredients in bokashi is lactobacillus. So this is the same thing that you would find in yogurt,
Mhm.
in sauerkraut, in things like kombucha. So that's the basic uh, organism that's in bokashi, and you can buy bokashi, you can make it yourself, or you could just use sauerkraut juice or silage inoculant, which you can buy at an ag supply store. Anyway, one way or another, getting this lactobacillus in there, which is an acid forming bacteria. It's a great complement to the alkaline biochar. So I have this bucket. I'm basically fermenting my food waste. So it's just like making naturally fermented pickles. So I'm fermenting my food waste with a little biochar, a little bokashi, and that gets started to break down. So by the time I put it in my hot compost pile, it breaks down so quickly. And it's got some biochar in it. I'll add a little more biochar. In the spring, when I'm making my spring compost pile, I'll put a layer of biochar on the bottom, and then I'll start layering the greens and the browns,
Mhm.
the weeds, and I'll put some of that pickled food waste in there, maybe some manure, more biochar, just making a layered compost. And then I'll let it compost, and it gets nice and hot. But one of the things about making compost with biochar is you don't really need to turn it. I might turn it once just to get the outside into the inside, but you don't need to constantly turn it and aerate it because the biochar holds air,
Yeah.
and it holds those microbes. It's the condo for those microbes. And so they're very happy in there. And I think in one of your videos you talked about how they have that party, and
Yeah.
after the party, they all go home
That's
and they
right.
make more little microbes.
That's right.
And then they spread out from there. So that's what's happening in your compost now. So there's a big party in your compost. It composts beautifully. It composts in half the time. And the biochar also encourages the fungi. So you get more
Mhm.
fungi in your compost. You get a better quality compost that's much is done much more quickly, much easier to manage because you're not having to turn it all the time. I just put it in a heap. I don't bother with any kind of bin or anything like that.
Sure.
And it's to me that's the biggest advantage of biochar is it helps me make much better compost with much less effort.
Yeah, and that's a great idea. It's a very good symbiotic relationship, because you want your biochar to be ready to feed your plants, and you want to make the compost as quickly as possible. And by mixing the two together, you're really getting the best of both worlds. So yeah, that I'd strongly advocate that. Another shout out to John Webster says, I want to plug an amazing video by Gardner Scott that he made 5 years ago. It's one of the best primer biochar videos out there. I've referenced it to thousands of people through the years. Well, thank you for that, John. And the reason I put up John's comment is not because I want to give myself a pat on the back, but just for those of you who are just joining us, I'm talking with Kelpie Wilson, the author of the Biochar Handbook. And my regular viewers know that I have been an advocate for biochar for many, many years. And so you can check out my video, you can check out Kelpie's book, you can check out some of the information that John Webster's giving us in the comments. And I think this is a great way to kind of enter the world of biochar because it's misunderstood and not fully appreciated. It's one of those things I think a lot of gardeners are just hesitant to move into. And so we don't, you don't, I want to try to make sure that we've been talking about making our own biochar, but you don't have to make your own biochar to use biochar. You talked about buying it. So, what are some of the best sources for someone who wants to get into the world of biochar? Where can they find it?
Well, I think if you go to the US Biochar Initiative website, there's a directory there of biochar producers. John actually probably could put something in the comments now about where to find biochar. It's because the industry is still a bit new, it's not available uniformly everywhere. I think if you live on the West Coast of the US, you can find it pretty easily in some of your garden stores. You can find it online, and go ahead and buy some online and start experimenting with it. The first biochar I ever used was something called horticultural charcoal, which was sold in the garden store, forever, for people growing orchids. And I got a
Oh, yeah.
little bag. It was like a 1 pound bag for $5. It's like, I want to try this stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, I had a little bit to experiment with. So go ahead and do that, and start playing around with it. And I really recommend learning yourself, because everybody's soil is a little different, to do some pot trials. So take a couple of tomato plants in a pot, or peppers or something like that, and do a few pots without your biochar and a few with, so you can really see what it does, and make sure you charge it
Hmm.
appropriately. Um, the great quick way to do that is with a little urine, if you're not squeamish,
Yeah,
or
there
some
you go.
fish emulsion, or some kind of good fertilizer, and just see what kind of difference it makes, and see if it's going to be worth it for you to invest more into it.
Yeah, this it really is one of those things you can see the results at the Galileo School Garden where I had 105 raised beds. One year, I took 5 beds and I used those 5 beds as a biochar field trial. And so one of the beds I put dry biochar in, and then the others, it was charged, and I had different ratios of the biochar in each of those beds. And it probably comes as no surprise to you, but the bed that performed the worst was the dry biochar. And for the reasons you already stated, it's going to suck up all the nitrogen in the soil and take it away from the plants in its effort to charge it. And in the other beds, I didn't really notice much difference, whether I had half an inch of biochar or an inch of biochar working it into the soil. But it was clear when I was doing this biochar field trial, all of the beds around those 5 didn't have biochar in them. And so while I was so focused on which biochar ratio was the best, all you had to do was just step back and you could see that all of the biochar beds were performing better than the surrounding beds that had no biochar in it.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, the question of how much to add is really an interesting one, because at this point, I've been doing this for 10 years now in my garden, and I have so much biochar in my soil. And it just, it just accumulates, but it doesn't seem like I have too much yet. Um, so it is an interesting question. I think you just get started with a little bit. Use it, use it right where the seed is. Use it right where the plants are. So if I didn't have a lot of biochar in my garden, I would take some charged biochar. And when I transplant a tomato, for instance, I would put a cup or half a cup of that in the planting hole where the roots can really access it. So it starts working for you right away.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to, particularly in the established beds, that I didn't necessarily have biochar at the time. I'll sprinkle it on the surface for a bed that I'm planning on doing a lot of transplanting in.
Hmm.
And as I dig the hole to put the plants in, some of the biochar is falling in. And I kind of use that as an opportunity to mix the biochar on the surface with the soil in the hole. So you're exactly, it is at literally at the root level when that plant goes into the hole. And then you do that a few times, and we touched on it a little bit, and John mentioned it in the comments as well. Once you've done that to a bed, once you have that biochar incorporated at the root level, you really don't ever need to do it again. So this isn't a yearly application where every time you transplant, you use biochar. You just get it at that root level. And then after that, you can go to no dig gardening and adding compost and whatever your preferred method is.
One of the things I love about it is what it does to the soil tilth.
Yes.
So at this point, I can stick my hand right down in the soil. It's not compacted at all. The biochar really fluffs it up.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, an important part of tilth is both the structure and the nutrition of the soil, and the biochar definitely makes that improved all the way around. And so yeah, I'm getting some comments about bokashi, and haven't done a lot about bokashi. We've talked a little bit about it in these live streams, but uh, the nice thing about the fermentation of your kitchen scraps like you're talking about is it's easy,
Mhm.
and you were talking about earlier with the manure and the carbon, the biochar, and taking away some of the aroma. That's one of the problems with bokashi is it can smell pretty bad. But how noticeable would you say it is when you mix it with the biochar as far as the splendid aroma of bokashi?
Wow, I like the smell of it. To me, it smells like food. I don't know. Anyway, my cat loves to eat it.
Okay.
It smells pickly. It doesn't smell. It to me. It makes the food waste bucket smell a lot better because putrescing food waste is pretty nasty. And
Exactly.
so the combination of biochar and bokashi really helps with odors. Um, for instance, urine, right? If you had to just save a bucket of urine, the smell is pretty bad. So when I take my biochar urine buckets, I fill the bucket full of biochar, and then I put some bokashi on top. And what that does is that actually helps, even though the biochar does absorb a lot of the odors, the little bit of bokashi on top just takes it all away.
Okay.
And
Nice.
that's because it's acidic, and whereas the biochar is alkaline. And when you put urine or urea into an alkaline environment, you get actually more production of ammonia. So while the biochar is absorbing a lot of the nitrogen, whatever it doesn't absorb tends to turn to ammonia a little faster. So that's why I put the bokashi on top of that. Just sprinkle a pint of it across the top of the bucket, and then you really have no odor. And something similar is happening with the food waste. So it's the combination really helps with the odor.
Nice. And so ammonia, of course, is a nitrogen source. The plants can't use ammonia, but when incorporated into the soil, the microbes then break it down and to forms like nitrate that the plants can use. You talk in the book as well about nitrates in the soil and biochar. So since the plants need the nitrate, how does that all work when we've got the biochar in our soil?
Yeah, so the nitrogen transformations in soil are immensely complicated, as you know. There's some bacteria that will turn ammonium into nitrate. There's others that will, turn that into nitrous oxide, which, it just is immensely complicated. And ammonia has two forms. It has a liquid form and a gaseous form, and plants can use the liquid form. So anyway, it's way more complicated than I could get into or even understand, but it has been really shown that the biochar tends to support the microbes that convert ammonia into nitrate. And then the advantage of nitrate is that it doesn't volatilize, so it stays in the soil from that standpoint, but it can leach with water. That's why you get nitrate pollution in
Mhm.
waterways. So what biochar does, though, is it hangs on to that nitrate and prevents the leaching. So that's really valuable from an environmental standpoint to and also from a nutrient retention standpoint. And I'll just describe an experiment that we did in a cattle barn where over 3 years. The first year, what the farmer was doing is he was scraping the manure out every year and just piling it, and it wouldn't, made a big, like, 30-yard compost pile, but didn't ever really compost because it was not balanced with enough carbon. So it just kind of dried out. And he would spread it on the field, and it was good. It was fertilizer. And then after that, the next year, we wanted to put the biochar in the barn so the cattle would poop on it and mix it with their hoofs, but we didn't have time. The timing wasn't right, so he mixed it afterwards. When he pulled the manure out, he tried to mix it with the tractor with some biochar. So we had that example. And then the third year, we finally got the biochar in the barn for the cattle to mix it, etc. Scrape that out of the barn at the end of the season. And that made the most beautiful compost. Unbelievable. Heated up, thermophilic, ended up with this beautiful friable kind of black soil full of nutrients. The one in between, and then I sent them all to a testing lab. The one that was composted fully by adding the char, and so it could catch the droppings as they came out of the cow,
Okay.
had 10 times more nitrate than the one that was not treated with biochar. And the one where it was mixed afterwards had, a little bit more, but not that much. So that just shows you how important it is to add the biochar at the beginning of the process, where it can capture those nutrients so they don't volatilize as ammonia, they don't leach away. And you can get a little advantage by mixing biochar with compost that's already composted, but you get so much more advantage by adding it at the beginning of the process, whatever it is, whether it's food waste composting, garden composting with greens and browns, or manure. And so 10 times more nitrogen, that's significant.
It is huge. And Liz G is saying, I imagine the benefit of biochar must be even better inside of a greenhouse where the rain doesn't constantly drain the nutrients. And so I'm a huge advocate, of course, of building a good, healthy soil. But this identifies probably an important point to make, not just within the greenhouse, but like you just pointing out, the the leaching overall is lessened with biochar. But when you've got a 10-time nitrate level, that also means you don't need to amend as often, and you certainly aren't going to need to use fertilizers as often because the biochar is making your soil even better, whether it's leaching out or not.
I do use fertilizer, but I don't use a lot in my garden. So, um, but fertilizing is nutrition. Plant nutrition is can be fairly complicated. There's more than nitrogen involved. One of the things that biochar does that's really interesting is it promotes the mycorrhizal fungi. Hello, from Norway. All right. It promotes the mycorrhizal fungi that help to solubilize phosphorus in your soil. And so it can really help your plants access phosphorus, which can be difficult because phosphorus likes to bind with other minerals and
Exactly.
become plant unavailable. So though the biochar doesn't necessarily hold on to a lot of phosphorus the way it holds on to nitrogen, it does improve the process of helping plants access the phosphorus.
Yeah, that's a great point because when we talk about leaching nutrients, we're primarily talking about the nitrogen components, but those other macronutrients that bind with the soil and basically just stay in place. That's why such a important balance should be obtained between the fungal network and the bacterial network, and so much focus is on the bacterial component when we talk about biochar. But when we talk about those mycelial threads, they're so small that yeah, this big condo is perfect for them as well to find the nutrients within the biochar. So I'm glad you mentioned that. The have you done any tests or are you aware of any tests? I know that the fungal networks work with the biochar, and you kind of touched on it. Does adding biochar increase the likelihood or increase the actual growth of the fungal networks within the soil?
According to the research, it does. Um, and yeah, and you can see the results in the phosphorus uptake in the plants.
That's important. So you mentioned it in the beginning. You're from Oregon. So what Serena's asking where you're from. Have you been on the West Coast for many years now?
Yeah, for many years. Yeah, I'm originally from the Midwest of the US, Illinois, but been living out here for quite a while. I lived in California for a bit, and I'm now in the southwest corner of Oregon near the California border.
Okay. I've got family in Oregon. I spent many visits enjoying the coast, the north, the south, the east, the west. Oregon's a wonderful place to grow. And so, in your book, you talk uh, at at length about some of the stuff that you're doing, and we talked a little bit about this before we came on the show. But let's talk about some of the forest work that you're doing, and how, particularly in Oregon, you mentioned that you've got a lot of forest products, which makes it easier to have those resources for making your own biochar. But let's talk about some of the other stuff that you're doing, particularly in Oregon.
Sure. Well, biochar is really good for trees, and one of the reasons is because it promotes the mycorrhizal network. And oh, I wanted to mention there's actually a company called Bigfoot Mycorrhizae that sells a garden product of mycorrhizal fungi to inoculate your garden, and they use biochar as a carrier
Oh, really?
for the for the fungi, for the spores. So that's that's another point about biochar and fungi. And so anyway, our forest soils here, these are fire adapted forests, and people may have heard about some of the really big wildfires we've been having here, and very scary, you know. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons is fire exclusion. So there are certain forest types where fire is a regular natural process. And when fires happen regularly, they don't tend to be catastrophic because they'll burn out the understory, and and the bigger, older trees won't die. And so it kind of encourages the big old growth. Whereas and then when fires come through regularly, there's not that much fuel to burn, so they don't burn as hot. So you get these regular fires that burn the understory, kill some trees, but overall the forest stays healthier. It's just a natural process, and as part of that process, a lot of biochar is made in a wildfire, especially one that's more of a cool underburn and not a catastrophic fire. The char will accumulate over centuries, and so in some of our forest soils, half of the soil carbon is actually charcoal. Now we've suppressed fire for over 100 years by going out and putting out every fire
Mhm.
that ever pops up, and as a result, we've created this unnatural condition of choked, thick forests. So when they do burn, they burn very hot. But we've also, the forests are losing their health partly because they don't have as much charcoal. They don't have as much charcoal to support the mycorrhizal fungi, to support all kinds of nutrient cycling, and in ways that we don't even know. We haven't even really studied it. But anyway, I'm really motivated to do what I can to try to return these forests to a better condition. Lots of people are working on this. A lot of what's being done is the forests are being thinned, and you end up with all these burn piles. And so then those are just burned, and there's two problems with it. One is they're not built very well, and they're not lit in a conscious way, so they make a lot of smoke.
Right.
So anybody who lives in a forested area, there's a certain point of the year where maybe your neighbors are just trying to get rid of all this debris and leaves, and they just make a burn pile and it smokes. And it's very annoying. Or maybe you're having to do that yourself, and it's like, well, you don't really have a choice. You've got to get rid of this stuff, and it's just making smoke, and it's a pain. So one of the things I'm doing, that's why I developed the Ring of Fire kiln, was to be able to handle some of this bigger amounts of material and make biochar and get some good out of it, and either leave it there for the forest soils, which need their biochar, or maybe take some of it home and put in the garden as well. And it's really a win-win kind of thing. But I've also been looking a lot at how to make biochar just in a regular burn pile. So this is another option for folks who are able to do a backyard burn pile. You can make biochar in your burn pile, even without a container. And it's just similar to the way I talked about at the beginning here of making biochar in a kettle grill, but you just make it on the ground. You build a pile. The style of pile I like to build is take your smaller material, more brushy, twiggy stuff, and make a really compacted mound with it, making everything kind of go in the same direction, and just pack it down. And then take any larger pieces like small logs that are straight poles and arrange those around the middle stuff in a teepee shape. And this helps concentrate the heat.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll light the pile on the top, and that creates a flame that will burn the smoke so it's clean. And then when it all burns down to the glowing coal stage, that heap of coals that you've probably seen in a campfire or a backyard fire pit, when it gets to that glowing coal stage, that's where you just put the hose on it and put it out with water. So it's cleaner and it's safer because you're putting it out with water at the end, and it's quicker because you've got that hot flame. I see a lot of people do a backyard burn pile where the flame never develops, and it just smokes and smolders. So it's smoldering and just putting out smoke. It takes a long time to burn material that way because it's not as hot. So this is much quicker. So you've got the flame, it's hot, it's quick. You put it out at the end, it's cleaner and safer. And then the other thing that happens is you've made biochar, of course, but you have avoided burning the soil. Because if you look at if you ever walk out in a forest where they've done a lot of burn piles from the thinning, you'll see that those piles were burned down to ash, and the hot charcoal that was sitting on the ground, that last stage of the burn, is very hot and it's directly in contact with the soil. And so that means that it's burning the organic layer of the soil.
Yeah.
And you're left with nothing but mineral dirt underneath that's dead. And then what happens is weeds come in. You get invasive weeds that come in, like thistles and knapweed and things like that. And so you've done no service to the soil there. So this is the simplest way to make biochar, and I'm really trying to promote this right now for anybody that's managing large amounts of biomass with burn piles. Please put it out with water. Build your pile correctly.
Right.
It doesn't smoke, and it's quick, and put it out with water at the end.
Okay, good. Good tips. I've been wanting to do this for so long, but we here in Colorado are pretty much on a continuous fire warning at most parts of the year. And so every time I've wanted to go out and make some amount of biochar, we have a fire restrictions that don't allow us to have any type of fires because of all those fire concerns, wildfires throughout the West. And so it's kind of skirting the issue because I'm not supposed to have any open flames. And so we or I first was familiar with backyard biochar making by doing it in the big burn barrels. And so essentially it's the same process. If someone is wondering about whether they should try to do an open burn on the ground, if you've got a burn barrel, it's the same basic concept, right?
Well, I'm glad you brought up that term because that term has caused me some problems. So, what is a burn barrel? Um, Many people may be familiar with it. You get a 55-gallon drum, usually. You poke holes in the bottom, and you throw. A lot of people that have in the past have burnt garbage this way,
Mhm.
and that's not a good thing. It's, the emissions are terrible. It's not good. And many regulators, I'm sure in Colorado it's the same, have outlawed a burn barrel for
Right.
that reason because people burn trash in it, or they have in the past. And another problem with it is that because you got holes in the bottom, air comes up from the bottom and out the top, and it can cast embers. So it's dangerous. So where burn barrels are permitted, they always require you put a screen on top of it to try and catch some of the embers. But basically, a burn barrel is not a good idea. However, there's another alternative that you could try, Scott, and anybody could try, which is called, remember I talked earlier about the stove, the tea-lead stove that you can make with
Mhm.
tin cans? Well, you can make a bigger version out like that out of a barrel. And I have some instructions in the Biochar Handbook for how to do that. But the difference is between that and a burn barrel is it's got a lid and it's got a chimney. And so you light it, you just, you're more conscious about how you process it. So my favorite design uses two barrels. And the bottom barrel is like a standard burn barrel in that you poke holes in the bottom and you set it up on a couple of rocks or bricks so air can flow up. And you're going to fill it full of um, one of the things that works best for me is there's a cabinet making shop that has little chunks of wood. So little chunks of wood,
Right.
because wood chips won't work. They pack too tightly. You need little chunks. Corn cobs could work as well, or just sticks. You take sticks and just break them up and fill it full of sticks. Then you get your second drum and you place it on top. But your second drum has holes, but large holes cut around the top. Or you could put a stovepipe in it, but really it works best if you just cut slots around the top, like a chimney cap, and maybe put some other holes around the side so air can come in. That's to burn the smoke that comes off of it. So you fill it full of your sticks, you light it on fire, so you've got a fire burning on the top. You set the second drum on top of that, and so then the smoke comes up. It's getting air, we'd call secondary air from the drum on top, and that burns all the smoke. So it's very clean. You just see heat fumes coming out.
Yeah, it's actually an incredible sight, and that's what we were talking about earlier. When I first started getting into biochar, it was those type of backyard kilns, and you can find some videos on that on YouTube, of course, and
Mhm.
and it's incredible to essentially see a smokeless burn because all of those volatile vapors are burning off, and it's not creating what we think of as smoke. So yeah, that's actually what I've got the vent. I've had this vent for 10 years because I want to make one of those. It's just the fire restrictions we have. I know my neighbors would call the sheriff on me. But yeah, yeah,
But you
thank
can
you.
get those drums at, a lot of, farm supply stores will carry those drums. You
Yeah.
can go pick up a couple of drums, and then you just need an angle grinder to cut the holes in the top drum, and a drill to do holes in the bottom. So it's a pretty good backyard project if you're handy with some power tools.
Yeah, but the lid is critical. My son has a burn barrel that he burns garbage in, and asked me a while back about if he could use that charcoal in the garden, and I didn't say it as eloquently as you did, but I said no, you really shouldn't be using your garbage that you have in an open top burn barrel in your garden. But if you take that extra step of putting the lid on it and then getting the appropriate air circulation, it can be done. And the reason I wanted to ask about that is because you talked about the damage to the soil if you do a burn directly on the soil. You can take a barrel configuration like that, elevate it on just a couple bricks, and it doesn't have any impact to speak of
Mm,
on the soil, and you're still able to get a biochar product as a result of it.
that's right.
And so there's so much information in the book, and as we draw to a close now, if you came in late, I'm talking to Kelpie Wilson, one of the world recognized biochar experts, and I don't say that lightly because it is true. But Kelpie wrote the book, literally, the Biochar Handbook, and there's a lot of information here. So I want to talk about the subtitle. So it's the Biochar Handbook, a practical guide to making and using bioactivated charcoal. So we've
Mm,
been talking a lot about the charging and the inoculating and the composting, but we actually have not really used that term in our discussion today. So let's go ahead and end with what differentiates bioactivated charcoal in this world of biochar.
Well, so you can charge the terms I use are raw biochar straight out of the kiln. It's just carbon, no life, nothing else but carbon. Then you would charge it with nutrients. So soaking it in nutrient solution, um, get some nutrients in there. So there's some other chemistry in there. And then bioactivation is the step of putting it in compost, putting it with a microbial inoculant of some kind, like bokashi, or just putting it in the soil over time, it will become bioactivated.
There you go. So I just wanted, because I'd seen that our wonderful moderator Jay has put up the link to your book, and I could see someone saying, "But they didn't talk about bioactivation." And yes, we actually have for the last 90 minutes. We've been talking about it, and it's important that the terminology matters. But when we're talking about biochar, and as you talked earlier with showing your fingers and where we are on the continuum of the carbon and where biochar fits in there, there's actually it is a range, right? Biochar is not a specific point on the carbon line. It's actually quite a range when we're talking about making biochar, buying biochar, using biochar. And I'd like to stress, and we can finish with this with your thoughts as well, that the definition is not that important as to whether it is on the continuum, on the extreme, or closer to the middle. If you have a good quality biochar, it is suitable for your garden.
That's right. Yeah. And because it's still a new industry and a new idea, test it out for yourself. Make sure it's going to work with your soil, because it could be a different pH. um, but the foolproof way of using biochar is put it in your compost, no
Yeah,
matter what kind of biochar it is. If it's not toxic, if it's something that you're buying, hopefully on the marketplace, it's going to be good. Or if you're making it yourself in the simple ways we've been talking about, put it in your compost, and that'll take care of any problems that you might that might happen because of pH or other issues.
That's great. So, well, Kelpie, can't believe how fast the time goes when we're having a nice
No.
conversation. But thank you so much for being here today. For everyone watching, I've got a link in the description below to Kelpie's book. And I may have missed it. Jay may have put a link to my video that I did a few years ago. And I've got more biochar videos planned if I can ever get past these fire restrictions and I can show how I make it in my backyard. But you are an inspiration, and thank you so much for talking about biochar today.
Well, thanks for having me, Scott. It was really fun. And I would encourage people to go to my website at wilsonbiochar.com because that's where you could find information about the Ring of Fire kiln and also the course that I'm offering through Regenerative Living Online. It's a 9-week biochar course. So there's a lot more to follow up on if you're interested at
Yes.
Wilson Biochar.
And I encourage everybody to go to Wilson Biochar and to do some of that follow up and also look for Kelpie's book. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you here. I do appreciate you.
All right. Thank you, Scott. That was fun.
Thanks.
Happy gardening.
Okay. And I also want to give a shout out to John Webster. Thank you, John, for being here today and helping so much in the comments and the background. And you can find out much more information through the Biochar initiative as well. So wonderful chat today. Thank you all for being here. I do appreciate you every Monday. And I love being able to bring some of these experts to talk about these topics that need to be answered. Our questions need to be answered on. So I appreciate your positive comments in the commentary. It's so wonderful. Everything that's been going, you've all been so wonderful helping each other out today. That's what makes the Gardener Scott community just such a great place on Mondays and why I keep coming back. And so I will look forward to you coming back as well next Monday when we do this all over again. So hope you have a wonderful gardening week. And every day that you're out there, just make sure you enjoy gardening. I'll see you next Monday.